Welcome to Chapter 10 of Intro to Psychology. In this video, I'll be talking about emotion. I'm a clinical psychologist, and so in my therapy sessions, I often use something like this emotion wheel to help people pinpoint the exact emotion that they're feeling. So I want to know if someone is feeling overwhelmed or disillusioned or withdrawn or appalled, so that I can better put myself in their shoes and know exactly what they are feeling. But it brings up an important question in that, when we talk about emotions, the validity of the terms that we use to describe how we're feeling. So, for example, is someone who says that they are furious, is that a significantly different emotion than someone who says that they just feel angry? Or if someone says that they feel worried, is that a significantly different emotion than someone who says that they are fearful? The validity of the terms that we use to describe emotions has been a hot topic for decades in psychology. And just like many of the topics that we'll touch on in this course, there are probably more questions than answers. What makes emotion easy to study is that everyone experiences emotions. So, thinking back to our chapter on the brain and behavior, not everyone experiences a stroke or a brain injury that allows you to study what parts of the brain control different functions in real life. Or, as we'll discover in a later chapter, not everyone experiences a severe form of mental illness, so you can test out which drugs work for treating depression or bipolar disorder. Not everyone experiences those things, but everyone experiences emotions from childhood all the way up until the end of a person's life. What makes emotions difficult to study is particularly how quickly they can change and how unstable they are. So you can see it in toddlers quite early on in life. A toddler can cycle through their emotions so quickly, being extremely happy one moment and then extremely sad in the next. And as people get older, that cycling tends to die down a little bit. We tend to be a little bit more stable, but it's still so hard to study emotions because they change and they vary so much between individuals, and also because we use so many different words to describe what we are feeling. So here are some basic terms that have been thought of in various fields to describe emotions and these different states of being that people experience. So when we say emotion, we're talking about a subjective state that we often use to describe our feelings. So it's usually something that occurs in response to a particular experience or a particular activity. And usually when we say the word emotion, we're talking about something that is usually short and relatively intense, and it's something that is consciously experienced. Then there's the word mood. Emotion and mood. So a mood is a prolonged emotional state. So when you experience that emotion for a prolonged period of time. So it might be in response to an event or something that happened to you, or it just might be your mood today. It might just be your stable pattern of emotion for that period of time. So you might say that, yeah, I was in a bad mood today at work. And it may not be specifically in response to anything. It just might be, I'm feeling bad today. Like it's just in general, this was my mood. Oftentimes in clinical psychology, we talk about mood over the course of, something lasting over 2 weeks or over many periods of time. And you might feel happy. Let's say if someone has a depressed mood, they might feel happy for certain moments within that period, but their general mood, their general stable condition is that they feel depressed or down. Then there's the word affect, or sometimes we say affect display. So that when we say mood versus affect, mood is the internal emotional experience, and affect is what we're showing to other people in the presence of other people. Any facial, vocal, or gestural behaviors that indicate what we are feeling on the inside. So facial expressions or our body language, those kinds of behavioral expressions of emotion, we call affect. So in the field of psychology, you'll often hear about affective disorders or that term affect used in other senses, and that's talking about disorder or affective disorders is talking about disorders that have to do with a discrepancy between how we are showing ourselves and how we're feeling on the inside. So emotion, mood, and affect, important terms to know. So for this video, I'm going to be focusing on some different models of classifying emotion. And these are all different ideas. There's none in particular that are necessarily better than the other. Feel free to take a deep look and look at the other resources on Canvas to see which ones you find provide the best explanation of how emotions work. The first one is Russell's circumplex model of emotion, which basically has two axes: arousal and valence. So when you talk about arousal, we're talking about the physiological activity that is required by a particular emotion. So there's some emotions like feeling upset or feeling excited that are high arousal. They're very intense emotions. And there's some other emotions like feeling fatigued or feeling calm, which are low arousal emotions. There's not a lot of intensity there. There's not a lot of physiological activity or physical activity. It's just a very low end of the arousal spectrum. And then on the other axis, there's valence. So that is how pleasant or how unpleasant the emotion is, how positive or negative the emotion is. So for example, someone who says that they are feeling excited, that is a very high arousal, high physiological activity, high intensity emotion, and also has a positive valence. It's something that people like to feel. It's nice to feel excited. Whereas someone who feels calm, it also has a positive valence, but it's a low arousal emotion. Another model of emotion is Plutchik's wheel of emotions, and he conceptualized emotions as being grouped on a positive or negative basis in kind of four different axes. So there's joy versus sadness. There is surprise versus anticipation. There's trust versus disgust, and there's anger and fear. And so he kind of conceptualized emotions working this in a similar way as colors. When we talk about colors, we often talk about primary and secondary colors. So primary colors like red and yellow would combine to form a secondary color like green. In the same way, he theorized that primary emotions can blend to form the full spectrum of emotional experience. So for example, someone who says that they are feeling contempt, that would be conceptualized as a mix of anger and disgust. That these two emotions would combine to form the feeling of contempt. One common criticism of this wheel of emotions is particularly the validity of some of these words, particularly the secondary emotions, such as particularly the emotion of love. When we talk about love, most sociologists, psychologists, and relationship experts don't describe love as an emotion. Love is a committed action towards a person over an extended period of time. So that's where we get the statement that love isn't a feeling; it's a choice. It's a behavior that you choose to engage in an altruistic manner over an extended period of time, and not just something that you experience in response to an event, like we commonly describe and previously described for emotions. Some more theories of emotions, or some more classifications of emotions. One that is posted on Canvas, a link to Ekman's Atlas of Emotions. This is based on the research of Paul Ekman, who is a prominent, probably the most prominent emotion researcher of the 20th century. He served as a consultant on the movie Inside Out, as well as the TV series Lie to Me. He did a lot of research on the expression of emotion in various cultures, as well as how best to detect if people are lying based on their facial expressions. And he basically theorized that there are five main broad categories of emotion, which are fear, anger, enjoyment, sadness, and disgust, which correspond to the characters in the movie Inside Out. And then in each of these different categories of emotion, there are different levels, very similar to the that wheel that I showed you at the beginning, where there's different levels of intensity For example, for fear. So there's trepidation, which is just anticipation of the possibility of danger. And then there's terror, which is an intense, overpowering fear that takes you over. And then there's levels of fear in between. What I like about this model is that he also lists out some of the responses or some of the functions that our emotions allow us to engage into. So when we experience an emotion internally, it can lead to certain actions on a predictable basis. So the experience of fear might lead some people to freeze in some situations, or it might lead some people to scream or yell in other situations. And Paul Ekman's work now focuses a lot on uh, helping people experience emotions in an adaptive and positive way, and not just eliminate those emotions, but help them feel them in a way that is good for their health and that is also good for their real life outcomes. Dr. Ekman also proposes that there are 7 universal facial expressions of emotion. So these aren't saying that there are 7 emotions, but there are 7 facial expressions of emotion, 7 universal ones that can be found in any culture. There are probably others, but these are the universal ones that no matter where you go, you'll be able to recognize or see people with these emotions on their faces. He did a lot of work here in the United States, as well as in Asia, as well as in smaller, more isolated cultures like in Papua New Guinea, where you find these same facial expressions across the board. So they are happiness, surprise, sadness, fright, disgust, contempt, and anger. And there's a link on to his website on the Canvas page where you can see or test out your ability to recognize these emotions. Now, although the recognition and production of facial expressions for certain emotions are universal, there are some cultural differences in the degree to which these facial expressions are shown, particularly publicly. So when we talk about cultural display rules, we're talking about standards that govern which displays of emotion are acceptable in a person's culture. So Ekman did a study in 1972 in which he had American and Japanese participants watch videos of highly stressful situations under 2 conditions. Some participants watched the videos alone, and others watched them in the presence of an experimenter. And what they found very reliably was that American participants, when they viewed something that was stressful, expressed negative emotions like fear, anger, and disgust, both alone and in the presence of others. Whereas the Japanese participants only expressed those emotions of fear, anger, and disgust when they were alone. They didn't publicly show it on their faces when they are in the presence of others. So this has to do with a cultural display rule in Japan, a very collectivistic culture, that there are certain emotions that are not encouraged, or that society does not encourage them to express publicly in front of other people. So research on emotion is heavily dependent on the culture that a person finds themselves in. Much of what we know about emotions stems from not just, as we can see here, the conscious expressions of emotions, but from subtle, unconscious, or automatic processes that go about in the expression of emotion. And much of what we talk about when we're saying unconscious emotions or unconscious processes has to do with the activity of the autonomic nervous system. So we saw this in our chapter on the brain and behavior, that you have the nervous system divided into the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system, which is our nerves outside the brain and spinal cord. And then you have the autonomic nervous system, which is smooth muscles and cardiac muscles and glands, and particularly the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system, which allows us to engage in our fight or flight response. So it helps prepare us for high arousal or stressful situations by changing certain physiological processes like dilating our pupils, increasing our heart rate, and things like that. And so whenever we're talking about emotion, we have to understand the complex interplay between what is consciously experienced in our minds, as well as the physiological aspects of that emotion. And there are 4 main theories of emotion that examine both the physiological aspects as well as the cognitive aspects or the conscious experience of emotion. The first is the James Lange theory of emotion, which is basically summarized as emotions are the result of physiological arousal, that it is the physiological arousal itself that leads us to experience that emotion. So, for example, you see a snake, and upon seeing the snake, your heart rate and your respiration increase, being activated by the autonomic nervous system. And then, because of that increase, that physiological change, you consciously experience the emotion of fear. That the physiological change is required for the conscious experience of fear. The next theory is the Cannon-Bard theory, which takes a different approach. This one suggests that physiological arousal and emotional experience occur simultaneously, that they're independent processes, but they happen at the same time, that you don't need the heart pounding to happen first before you experience the feeling of fear. So you see a snake and you experience both of those, the physiological arousal and the emotion, at the same time. And there's some interesting empirical findings to support this notion. For example, a 2010 study used Botox injections to paralyze people's facial muscles so that they couldn't frown with it and they couldn't make really sad facial expressions. And what they showed is that people who were depressed and had their facial muscles paralyzed experienced or reported less depression because they couldn't actually engage in the facial expressions or in the expression of that emotion that is typically associated with being depressed. And so it suggests that physiological arousal is not necessary to experience that emotion. The next theory is the Schachter-Singer two-factor theory of emotion, which posits that emotions are comprised of two factors, physiological and cognitive factors, and that physiological arousal is interpreted in a specific context that leads to the conscious emotional experience. So you see a snake, and the combination of physiological arousal and your cognitive assessment of the situation help you interpret the situation as being, oh, these two elements together add up to make fear. And that addition, that combination, is what allows you to experience the conscious experience of fear. And this is a very important or more modern theory because it really promotes the idea that physiological arousal can be very similar across different types of emotions. So your heart rate will increase if you see something, or if you see someone that you really want to impress, or if you're scared of something. Both of those could cause your heart rate to increase. And so that heart rate increase alone does not tell you what the emotion is, like is proposed in the James Lange theory. If your palms are sweating, if your heart is racing, if you have increased respiration, that could be very many different emotional experiences. And so it's the context, it's your cognitive appraisal or cognitive understanding or label of the situation that combines with the heart pounding or with the physiological response to allow you to experience that emotion. And lastly, there is the Lazarus theory of cognitive mediational theory of emotion, which is when emotions are determined solely by our appraisal of the stimulus. So this is more of a common sense approach to what we think would happen when we experience the emotion of fear, for example. So you see a snake and you cognitively realize that it's a snake and that it could hurt you, and then you start experiencing heart pounding or increased respiration. This is different than the Schachter and Singer model in that appraisal occurs before the labeling of emotion, and that appraisal is immediate and unconscious. And this one, as I said earlier, makes, it seems to make sense that we think about it first, that we see a fearful situation, and then our body reacts. But it's doesn't have as much research evidence behind it, particularly because the physiological responses, in this case of fear, happen so quickly. They happen so quickly, it's hard to believe that our actual cognitive appraisal of the situation causes our heart to beat faster, that it's probably something that's much more unconscious and much more automatic.